Much as I hate to admit it, I don't think Brad Lambert is going to be making the Winnipeg Jets out of training camp and preseason this year.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to today's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platform and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and assures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight, we're going to talk about preseason because obviously the Jets have some very big decisions to make, and some of those decisions are probably the first big crossroads that we've really seen this year, and I can guarantee you Jets fans are not going to be happy with the first one. And the first, unfortunately, is that Brad Lambert is probably going to start the year with the Manitoba Moose. Barring a surprise, I think that is most likely where Brad is going to end up. And if I'm being honest, I can't really argue against the decision. We'll chat about why in just a moment. But before we go any further, did want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. All you have to do is visit FanDuel.com to get started and get in on the action right now. Like I just mentioned, Brad Lambert, I think, is probably moose-bound. And I love Lambert, right? I think during training camp he looked great. Preseason has been a little bit of a different story. This is the first time that Lambert has faced above AHL competition on a pretty routine basis. And if we're being honest, the results have been not bad, but I think a little mixed. I didn't get a chance to watch yesterday's game too closely just because it was geo-locked and I couldn't find a completely legal stream to actually catch up. But from apparently what I saw from the scoreline and from folks who were watching the game live, I didn't miss too much if we're being honest. But my thoughts on Lambert actually go back even before this recent game over the weekend. I think the biggest thing with Brad is that he is really good against players at his skill caliber, which is honestly AHLers. I think the next jump for him is getting used to the timing and the skill tier of the NHL. I thought that there were moments where the spacing and the timing were just a little too fast for him, where he wasn't able to make the snap decisions that you would like, and where he's able to sort of boss proceedings relatively well at the AHL level. It seems like encountering actual NHLers, and apparently yesterday's matchup against one of the top centers for the Wild just really wasn't able to dictate the terms of play. And I think that that's generally been the case when he's faced up against harder matchups, right? The Jets have basically given him in preseason top six center duty, and I don't think he's run away with it, which I kind of said from the beginning that I didn't think 2C was going to be the best starting point for him. The problem is that with Lambert, I don't know if you really can afford to put him in really low volume minutes, right? I think Lambert is the kind of guy who really thrives when he's playing a lot and when he's, able to dictate the terms of play on a routine basis and is actually getting used to a higher level of play and standard of play compared to what he's used to. And so for me, I struggle with the decision here because if you send him back down to the Moose, yeah, he might come out, starting to rip things up. He might feel even more motivated, and I think that that's actually a pretty likely outcome, is that he torches with Manitoba and basically forces a call-up sometime within the early portion of the season. But I think the bigger reality with him is that whereas Nikita Chibrikov looked pro-ready for the NHL almost from the first couple of games, Lambert looks a little further away, but not that far away. It's just that there's a couple of things that you can kind of tell he's not quite there yet with. I think the skating is there. I think the shooting and passing are generally there. But I think, the decision-making, the timing, that stuff he's still working on. And the only way that he's really going to get it is either by just murdering his minutes at the AHL or playing enough at the NHL level to where he starts to grow accustomed to it. But I wouldn't be surprised if, considering how raw he is at this point, if the regular season this year is a bit of a tough stretch for him, especially if he makes the team. But I kind of feel like with Winnipeg having a lot of veterans on the roster right now, with them not having really made any trades to get guys off the roster, I don't really see a spot immediately for Lambert. And I really do hate to say that because I was kind of one of those guys who was advocating for the Jets to be fairly aggressive with their youth making the team. But unless Lambert really kills it, and at the end of this preseason tournament, which I honestly wouldn't be surprised if he's one of the cuts over the next couple of days, I just don't see a path for him to really earn a big top 9 role with this team right out of camp. And I don't like saying that. I wish it wasn't the case, but unless something drastically changes, he probably needs a little more seasoning. All that said, I'm not sitting here saying that he was bad by any stretch. I think that there's just a couple of things that are still not quite there for him yet, and he probably needs a little more dominance at a lower level first, and he's getting there, right? The past year was the first real pro season in North America he's had sustained. So that I don't think should be overlooked. I also don't think it should be overlooked that the skill barrier for the NHL is very high at this point. And so for young early 20s players to struggle initially, I don't think that should be a sign that they're a bust or anything. I just think it's actually reflective of how hard the league is at this point. And so for Lambert, I wouldn't take this if he gets sent down as something to be discouraged by. I think he made a pretty decent case, especially early on, but you're just starting to see some of the youthfulness kind of show in his game. And, the lack of NHL experience, I think, is going to make it harder for him, especially if the Jets want to make the playoffs. If that's still their plan this season, then Lambert probably isn't ready as is until he starts getting a little deeper into the season. And it's not like I don't think he won't play games this year. I just think coming out of camp, out of preseason, first few games, first few weeks or even months, I have a hard time seeing where Lambert fits. And inevitably, there will be injuries. So it's not like Lambert doesn't have an early path back to the team. If somebody gets hurt in the top 6, then maybe you see if Lambert, with some motivation, a little more AHL seasoning, hopefully at that point some early success in the year, comes back a refreshed young player and becomes a more instrumental part. But what I've kind of maintained even before we saw him in preseason and stuff is that he does probably need some more time before he takes on that 2C mantle. I just didn't think that would be a fair ask, and I wanted it to be the case, but I didn't think he was ready for it. And I think preseason has basically confirmed my suspicions. I think he will be a good player down the road, and I think that that's a very likely scenario, but I just think as it is right now, Brad still has some things to do to put 2 and 2 together before you start asking him to do really big minutes. And I just think the Jets have a huge roster backlog that or logjam, if you will, that kind of prevents him from getting into a more prime spot. So overall, a tough camp for him in some ways, but I think you saw enough promise and intrigue that you can definitely see why so many of us are hyped on him. I think that he overall still had a fairly successful camp in preseason, considering that not even Chibrikov, who outshined him in my mind, is likely to make the Jets either. I wouldn't be too discouraged if I was Brad. If anything, I think this is just going to serve to give him motivation to push harder, to fight for more of a spot, and to improve his game, because honestly, he really isn't that far off. It's just a couple of key things that'll get him up to speed, and then I think he'll be ready to start taking on full-time NHL minutes. But curious to know what you saw in preseason. Let me know if you disagree and if you think he's ready. How would you handle this? Would you be comfortable giving him fourth line minutes? Would you, heavily shelter him? I have a hard time with that just because I think if you play him a little too sheltered, he's not going to learn all that much from playing 8 minutes a night. So it's a tough road, and it's the first real crossroads the Jets have faced outside of the trade stuff this season. So tough decision, but I think I know which way the Jets are going to lean on that one. Now, speaking of preseason and stuff, you probably did hear me talk a little bit about Chibrikov, and Chibrikov's not the only guy that is maybe fighting for a spot and perhaps is unlikely to get it. We have to talk a little bit about the Jets defense because that has had some really big changes over the past couple of games. The past week has not been great news for the Jets' defensive depth, especially on the left side. And with Winnipeg kind of ailing a little bit, it does mean that there is not only competition, but also some potential for moves that need to be made in the near. We'll dive into all of that in just a quick moment, but before we go any further, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at Indeed. We're all driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. You should instead match with Indeed. Indeed is the best hiring service out there because it helps you schedule, screen, and message, reducing the amount of busy work it takes to actually find quality candidates. And Indeed isn't just helping you hire fast, it's matching you with tons of highest quality candidates available. 93% of employers agree that Indeed delivers the best candidates out of the candidate pool, which is, for somebody like me who actually used Indeed when I was looking for work, I can personally attest to how convenient it is, how great the resume building service is. It actually allows you to find jobs that not only align with your work experience, your discipline, some of the stuff that you're interested in personally, but if you have salary requirements, it will actually show you those jobs too. It's a great service. It's very straight to the point, and it offers a great flexible platform that honestly gives you tons of options for matching quality candidates and finding folks that maybe even sit a little bit outside your requirements if you're trying to expand your pool. But with over 3.5 million businesses worldwide already using Indeed, you should probably be able to tell that they are a fantastic service. And if you're a listener of the show, you get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on Locked On Winnipeg Jets. That's Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. While we're at it, I did also want to shout out our friends and partners at Gametime. When it comes to buying tickets, a lot of you are probably used to spending tons of money because, well, you put the ticket in your cart, you think you're getting it for one price, and then you go to check out, and wow, holy cow, there's a lot of surprise fees, a lot of hidden charges, and what looks like one ticket fee is actually amounting to maybe 2 to 3 tickets worth of extra fees, which is pretty crazy, right? Because you're just going by yourself. You ain't buying for 2 or 3 people. It's just you. Gametime totally gets your pain, and that's why they have a special option to toggle called all-in pricing that allows you to see what you're paying up front. And Gametime has even introduced a new feature to help you save time and money called Gametime Picks. Gametime Picks filters out the fluff, so you're only seeing like the best incredible deals on great seats, which makes it easier to avoid wasting time looking for all of these seats that you don't want to pay for, right? Gametime Picks is here to make it very easy, very to the point. And, as somebody who goes to Orioles games, Ravens games, and all this other stuff, look, I know how expensive this stuff gets. I go to plenty of music concerts too. Not a Swiftie, but if you are, I'm sure that there are plenty of times that you have paid crazy prices for tickets. But Gametime is here to help. They want to show you the best deals, and you can even see seat views before you buy. So you're actually getting a pretty good idea of what you're buying and not just going in blindly to some section and you find out that the view either sucks or is obstructed. Unless you kind of like that thing. Maybe you're a Red Sox fan and you enjoy it. But if you're ready to get started, take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Just download the Gametime app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on today's episode as we're talking a little bit about, well, some challenges during Jets preseason that maybe weren't nearly as anticipated, but in other ways perhaps not as surprising. I think the biggest thing for Winnipeg is that, let's be real, right? The Jets have had a bit of a bumpy preseason, and already we're kind of seeing why I said I thought this team was going to take a step back this year. I love the Jets. I think that they're still a very strong team, but if we're talking about the top contenders in the Central, the Jets are just not going to be one. Hellebuck is going to do a lot to raise the floor, but I think the reality of some of the departures of the veterans and the fact that some of the youth look perhaps a little more mixed in their readiness for the NHL just tells you that Winnipeg is maybe in a bit of a transition season, right? I've maintained this year that I think the biggest thing for me is that this team takes a step forward organizationally and, developmentally, and not so much that they make the playoffs. If they do, that's great. But I think the Jets are kind of a little further away from being competitive this season than just relying on the youth and having them hit their stride. Winnipeg probably needs to make a couple of trades or something, just because the team as it is, it's a little thin. And it's especially dealing with some big losses on the injury side early on already. Ville Heinola, this was supposed to be his year. He's sidelined at least a month with an ankle infection that he has now had surgery on to remove a screw that I think caused the infection. As far as anyone knows, it's not as serious as it would be if it was like very soon after the initial surgery, but I'm just speculating here. That's just based on what some folks have said about the timeline and the fact that Heinola himself didn't really seem to notice it as much, at least from what we've heard. So maybe that's good. But then, that would have meant Logan Stanley or maybe Hayden Fleury would need to step up. And apparently it's going to be Fleury because Stanley had some issue where he tweaked something and now needs knee surgery, which is like a minimum of 4 weeks recovery. And that's just what has been put out publicly. Wouldn't be shocked if that recovery period extends for a longer point. So Winnipeg's left-sided D depth has already taken some big hits early. Hayden Fleury was brought in to likely be a Moose player at first, but now he's going to have to take on a bigger role. Fleury in camp and preseason, I think, has been okay. I wouldn't really say that I'm expecting a ton here, but if he does end up being a serviceable NHLer, that's fine with me, right? Would love that for him. Would be a great way to sort of kick off his Jets tenure. But again, I'm not really expecting loads. Otherwise, Winnipeg is just thin on forward depth too. And like the right-sided D depth, if I had to rank it right now in terms of performance, it's going to be DeMello, Miller, and Pionk, which for most contenders, probably not a good enough right side as is. The Jets are going to have to trade for probably a left-sided D anyway, so maybe you also look at some right-side stuff. I don't know. Winnipeg also probably needs to figure out the top 6 center problem because I love the Mesnikov. He's probably not the guy that I would really ask to do this, though. And, with the Jets, honestly, probably sending all of the prospects either back to junior or to the Moose. I don't really see any youthful players making the jump out of camp. Chibrikov, again, is the guy that I think earned a spot, and I really wish he would. But given the fact that Winnipeg has like a million players of a similar position and skill type already on the roster, and the fact that the Jets are likely to prefer the veterans over the kids, I wouldn't be shocked if Chibrikov is also spending time with Lambert on the Moose. Again, I wish it wasn't this way, and I think there would be a decent pathway to getting both into the lineup, probably in sheltered minutes at the NHL level. But given how Winnipeg has traditionally been and the fact that only Chibrikov was the one who really looked like he was reasonably close to being a full-time NHLer, I just wouldn't be shocked if they send both down and sort of punt the issue until later this season. So the Jets this year, I'm going to be honest, I don't think that they're going to be that great. Preseason has kind of been a little bit of a mixed bag. It's hard to get a full read on it, and we won't know how this team truly is probably until the final couple of preseason games this week. I think that's when we'll start to have a clearer picture. But so far, if anything, is to go by from the first couple of games, like I said, I think there's going to be bumps and bruises. Arniel hasn't quite been as different as I was hoping for yet. And again, it's just preseason, so I don't want to read too much into the early results. But my suspicion is that, we may not see as much of what I'm hoping for from Arniel early as he starts to wade into full-time duty as the Jets head coach. So, I look at this preseason and if you kind of come away from this not feeling super optimistic, I don't blame you. I wouldn't say that I'm super optimistic myself, but then again, I also didn't come into the season expecting the Jets to really smoke it out and be this top contender. I thought that this was going to be a year where the Jets might honestly flirt with missing the playoffs. And if that happens, I don't think people should necessarily be upset if the team is still focused on developing and getting their players in the pipeline up to the NHL in the right way. If they're not doing that and they still miss the playoffs and they try to be competitive, I would have issues with that. But I don't think that that's the way it's going to go. If anything, I think the Jets might just fly a little too close to the sun and things might start to fall apart as players maybe get asked to do roles that are perhaps a bit too big for them. And, the kids maybe take some time to get up to speed at the NHL levels. So, for me, I'm a little disappointed that, Lambert maybe didn't run away with the job like we all hoped. But again, given how hard it is to make it at this level of the NHL these days, I'm not shocked, right? And I said even before all of this, to see all that stuff, probably a little too much to ask of Brad coming out of his first rookie season in North America. So, with all that in mind, I think the Jets are still on the right pathway so far. Don't go crazy and trade for a bunch of really bad contracts. Be smart about what you acquire. If you make a waiver claim, look for some guys with some interesting upside, but don't just bring in veterans to have warm bodies. Make sure that these are guys who are actually going to push not only the other veterans, but some of the kids to really fight for spots and give their best for the team. So a lot of stuff for the Jets to figure out. And I kind of want to talk about that because for me, I think the biggest question that I have is what comes next for this team, right? What is their plan with injuries already setting in, with uncertainty about which players might actually be ready for NHL duty? What is this season's likely trajectory? What are the Jets going to do to start the year? I want to talk about that in just a quick moment, but before we go any further, did want to shout out our friends and partners that I referred to earlier at FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Those of you who have heard about us talk about FanDuel before, you know that it's safe, secure, and easy to use. They cover tons of big sports, whether you're into the NFL, NHL, MLB. Obviously, the playoffs for the MLB are starting up soon. As an Orioles fan, probably the best time to be alive. For you Blue Jays fans, I apologize. It's been a bit of a rough year for all of you. But just because the Blue Jays didn't necessarily make it doesn't mean that you still can't win big. FanDuel covers all of your opposing teams too. And if you're getting a hunch in the middle of one of these playoff games, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. So if you see something that you like in the middle of an inning, maybe it's your time to go with your hunch and win big. And you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's all on FanDuel.com, or you can download the FanDuel app. That's FanDuel.com. Get started and get in on the action right now. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Jets, as we are just wrapping up with some bigger questions going forward about Winnipeg's future, both near term and perhaps longer term. This season for me, I've maintained was one that I viewed as, I wouldn't call it a rebuilding season, but this was probably a year where the Jets, I expected to go through some patchier, more troubled waters over the next few months, perhaps even beyond that, as Winnipeg kind of wrestles with turning the roster over to the kids, and some of the kids just may not be ready for NHL duties. So the Jets are kind of in a tough spot. They've got some expiring contracts, they're transitioning over, and with Winnipeg trying to figure out what sort of team it wants to be going forward, you kind of run into a situation where you're like, well, all right, so what do we do this season, right? Is our goal to make the playoffs? Are we focusing on development? What is the utmost importance for the Jets to focus on? And I kind of come back to the idea that this should be a developmental season, and it should be to really serve for next season more than anything, right? If you set up the following seasons for success, then I would consider that a successful year this season. It doesn't have to lead to the playoffs this year, but I think for the Jets, it's really critical that, whether it's getting Lambert up to speed, figuring out how to get him and Chibrikov into the lineup, maybe working with Elias Salamanca and getting him up to speed. All of these guys, I think, are going to play bigger roles with the Jets next year. And for all of that to happen, the Jets kind of have to set the table nicely. And maybe that's what this season should be about, is if you think about it like an extension of this offseason, getting rid of some of the clutter, working on, the developmental path to the NHL, getting guys up to speed, and slowly but surely building this team out to be a future contender. Because I don't think the team is like crazy far away, but, by the same token, compared to other teams in the division and elsewhere around the league, the Jets are not that close. So for me, if the Jets can find a way to make this pipeline to the league a lot more stable, get the kids in, and actually allow them the time and space to make mistakes and figure out how to be full-time NHLers, I think that would be great. But if it doesn't fully happen this year, I don't think it's going to be like a complete disaster, but I think Winnipeg really has to approach the season with the idea that it's about the following years. I don't think we're really worried about a competitive window at this point. That 2-year window that seemingly was pretty locked shut and really a thing to focus on in the following season that would have led into the season has kind of all changed with some of the departures and Winnipeg's own approach to what it wants to do this season under Arniel. So, I guess I am still like excited about the future of the team, but I think it comes with some expectation that, again, I think we're probably going to have more bumpy patches than good days this season. I could be misreading that, but that's just my interpretation. And I don't think that that's something that I'm worried about. I don't think it's something that I'm going to be upset about. I think the only thing that would really piss me off with this team is if the Jets sort of moved in retrograde motion and didn't take steps forward as an org. But so long as Arniel actually practices what he preaches and the kids continue to show good growth insofar as the Jets can usher in that direction, then I can't complain. I think the Jets generally had a successful offseason. I think they avoided some bad stuff. I don't think that there were quite as many trades as I would have liked. I think it would have been nice to help make some room for some of the kids. But given how Lambert is, and given that Chibrikov is competing with a spot that has crazy amounts of depth and it would take multiple trades to make that happen, maybe it's for the best that he, at least for now, spend some time with the Moose. But otherwise, I think the Jets are in an okay spot. I just don't think we're talking about a competitive streak this year. So let me know what your season predictions are. I kind of feel like the Jets are going to be fighting for a wild card. That's sort of where I have it. And if that's the case, I don't think that really upsets me. I just want to see that this team is actively working on the areas where the organization is deficient, that they are, developing the right habits. The special teams already look like they took a step forward. I know it's just preseason, but the power play has scored a couple of times. Cole Perfetti in his first game or so back scored and assisted, so that's cool. I think, if Cole really hits it out of the park this year and really earns that next big contract in the year after, that would be great. I have been a big believer in him. I think he's a huge breakout candidate, and maybe not having Lambert and some of the other kids to fight with will showcase why I continue to be so high on him and why the team honestly should have given him a long-term offer. But we'll just have to be patient for that. In the meantime, the Jets do still have a couple of preseason games left. They've got matchups against the Flames to close it out on the 2nd and the 4th, and then next Wednesday, it is officially going to be the start of the season, October 9th, 10 p.m. road game against the Edmonton Oilers. 9 Central for all of you who actually live in Winnipeg, unlike me. But, for the rest of us, late game, I'm just hoping that the Jets have at least some fun over the next couple of games. We'll see a more starting lineup sort of team, and hopefully the Jets take care of business against Calgary. The Flames should be a relatively straightforward opponent for the next couple of preseason outings, but given how preseason has been for the Jets, maybe I shouldn't ask for too much. But let me know what you think of the current state of the Jets. Are you okay with the direction of the offseason? Drop your thoughts and comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day. And as always, have a great night and go Jets go.